on, Mo. Good boy. Come on.
Welcome to Moments of Experience, a podcast inspired by my faithful best friend, Mo, a 14-year-old beagle who gave us moments of hope, compassion, and love during a time of tragic loss and life-threatening family illness. I'm your host, Jeffrey Smith, and I invite you to join me for powerful, uplifting, and sometimes even challenging conversations with some of the world's leading innovators in employee, patient, caregiver, and human experience. Together, we dive into the meaningful moments that shape us, move us, and inspire us to pursue our purpose in life. I'm glad you chose to join us as we explore the big and small moments that bring meaning to our lives and connect us to our true calling. So welcome, Matt. I am so excited to have you here on Moments of Experience, and thank you so much for joining me.
Jeffrey, I'm so excited to be here. I can't wait to have a nice conversation with you.
Yeah, so I always start out, I don't read canned bios. I think they're boring. So I tell the guest who they are to me, how they show up to me, and then I'll have you react to that. So Matt Poepsel is an author, a Marine, an Ironman, and a self-improvement junkie that enlightens leaders to break free from outdated attitudes and behaviors in the workplace. That's how I see you. And I didn't use this part because it wasn't my own words, but I've also heard you referred to as the godfather of talent optimization. So that's an interesting title, but I'd like you just to introduce yourself in your own words.
Yeah, I would say that I'm a seeker trying to find things that work to help myself, and I'm pretty transparent as well in trying to share and make myself vulnerable, but also share the good stuff, the things that excite me and motivate me, specifically in the areas I would say, as you mentioned, of self-improvement, of leadership, of helping organizations work better. I tend to really gravitate towards the world of work and all of its glory.
So thank you very much. And how I really start the show is by telling my guests kind of the reason I wanted to have them on. What inspires me about your work? What have I learned from you, or what resonates with me about your work? And, you know, I've been looking at my guest list recently, and I realized I've been skewing. Like, listen, we talk about 4 areas of experience in this show. We talk about employee experience. We talk about human experience, but we also talk about patient and caregiver experience. And a lot of that overlaps to my guests in the healthcare world, but I am really excited to hear your perspective on the broader world of work, on the future of work, on the future of leadership. And quite frankly, there is a lot of synergy from reading things you've written and what I've heard the research you are doing to advance modernized workplace culture. So I'd like to, we know right now that the workforce demographic and the world of work is rapidly changing. But what I'd really like your thoughts on, because I've heard you speak on it, is how are we approaching leadership? Is that changing at a proper pace to keep up with the changing workforce?
Yeah, the short answer is no. And I really love that you've got this deep dive in healthcare specifically, but also recognizing that there's things we can learn regardless of whatever domain that we're in. We can learn by picking up our gaze sometimes and getting up out of the business and taking a look around and seeing things that are headed our way, because it's true in healthcare, it's true in manufacturing and construction. The experiences that we have, whether they're employee experiences, as you mentioned, or even just human experiences, they're defined outside of healthcare, in this case. And so I think that one of the benefits I have is being able to work with so many different types of companies and having the chance to consume so much different types of research from domains as diverse as psychology, business, everything neuro, philosophy, theology, you name it. And I think trying to see the interconnections between these things leads to some pretty novel conclusions. So to answer your core question, we have seen this dramatic evolution when it comes to the way that work is done. And we went from very authoritarian kind of work management styles all the way through the information age and now the knowledge age and whatever's coming next with the rise of AI and everything. And, we're really also seeing this shift when work is done at its best towards, sometimes it's known as stakeholder capitalism or conscious capitalism, where the business is looking to serve more than just its own bottom line. And I've seen a similar trajectory when it comes to humans at the peak of human experience too. We understand from Maslow that we need to meet our basic needs before our relationship and our esteem needs, all the way up to self-actualization and even self-transcendence. And so when I look at how organizations are starting to structure themselves, it's increasingly selfless. The same is true for people at their best. At the peak of human experience, we act in a selfless way. We serve things that are bigger than ourselves. And so I started to ask myself, what's the selfless model of leadership? And there isn't one. Even servant leadership is still very much focused on, the role of the leader in a relationship to the other person. And that's where I feel like it's time for us to adopt some more of these more enlightened techniques, move away from those outdated attitudes and beliefs, as you said, Jeffrey, towards something that really tries to keep all that self-interest in check, because it really wrecks a lot of, what the workforce is looking for today, what I believe that the world needs from us today.
And that's really interesting. The selfless model of leadership. And I think that does apply to all industries. And as you look, and I talk a lot about this, using healthcare as a backdrop about the changing workforce demographic, that we're having challenges in knowledge transfer from generation to generation just because of lack of an understanding. And in healthcare specifically, at a time where our largest generation is aging, first of all, out of the workforce, but second of all, aging into the healthcare system at the exact same time we're having a nursing shortage and things like that. It's a fascinating time in the world of work. And I love that you take it from so many different perspectives, because there is a lot to learn from other industries. I always like to say, healthcare is at the forefront of clinical innovation, yet lags 30 years behind the private sector and people strategy. So I wish the industry I serve would be more willing to look outside their myopic industry and learn from people like you that are just seeing it from all different angles. Is when you mentioned, no, they're not, the leadership model is not keeping up with the shifting workforce. Can you give me an example of someplace you've seen it just done right? See, it's just done brilliant, where the leadership is forward thinking, is selfless.
Yeah, I think when you look at this situation, for example, when we look at organizations that are doing more than just serving their own bottom line, you see a lot of great examples. One example that's pretty well known is Bombas. They sell socks, very high-end socks, very well-made socks. But what a lot of people know about it, and the reason that they like to think about Bombas sometimes, is that they donate a pair of socks to the homeless, and they even constructed their own specialized socks for the homeless because the standard socks wouldn't really suit their needs as well. That's an example of a company that's saying we can do well and we can do good all at the same time. And they run a profitable business and they win employee awards. So when you start checking off all those boxes and people are willing to, be a part of that's an example that works pretty well. And we don't have to be able to have these intensely social missions just to be able to have meaningful work in this way. Because if you serve your community, for example, even if you're a dry cleaner, you might not look at that as being a way to change the world. But for people who want to have that service, maybe they've got an important job interview or something, and they want to have their suit pressed right away so that they can provide for their family and reach that next level in their mind. Whatever it is, I don't think we have to work artificially hard to do it, but we have to see our work that we do as something that gives us purpose and meaning and makes a positive contribution. Whether we have some organizations that volunteer for Habitat for Humanity and they let workers take paid time to go and work in their community. So it's not that hard, but I think it's exceptionally rare to see something like that win out in terms of the volume war versus, the fretting about efficiency, profitability, right? All the things that affect the me, the self-awareness, the fear that drives us toward our own bottom line. And what's ironic about that, Jeffrey, is that when we start approaching leadership, I should say, in a way that is how I describe it is, it's not about you, right? It's about the mission and it's about the people on this journey with you. If you do those two things well, you're going to be just fine, right? So a lot of times I say we have to have our own self-interest. Of course, we're not trying to be completely selfless. That's too far for most of us to go. But can we at least keep our self-interest in check a bit? And I'll bring it back to healthcare for a second. Based on one of the things that we see is that, for example, more experienced nurses learned how to be effective nurses in a very different way than up-and-coming nurses. And so the way that they learned, the access to digital, the amount of information that they had access to, the nature of the techniques, the fact that they might have gone through schooling during COVID, didn't have the same level of experience on the floor and the same socialization. But what happens oftentimes when we take a me-oriented sort of view of this is that when I've gotten to a senior position, maybe I'm the CEO, maybe I'm a senior nurse, and I say, well, these young people coming up behind me need to do what I did. Well, that was 20 years ago. What aspect of life today is all that relevant compared to 20 years ago? Instead, from a selfless leadership perspective, you say, what is the mission and what is the needs of these people around me? And put myself, ideally, last. And so now all of a sudden, if I could let go of the fact that maybe they have a different style than I do, or they have access to technology that makes their onboarding a lot easier than mine was back when 20 years ago, right? Then all of a sudden, I think we get a higher order of leadership, and one that actually is going to serve us better in terms of getting the level of employee engagement, getting the patient care outcomes, getting the operational effectiveness and efficiency. But when the me issues creep in, and all of a sudden, I'm kind of put out because I'm like, oh, I had to work harder than that. They've got it so easy these days. The more that seeps in, the more it actually sours everything.
Yeah, and it takes me back to a couple of things you just said that ties back to one of my first my actually very first episode where I explained the story of my dog Mo. But my guest, we were talking about when we went to college, there was no internet, so we talked about the difference in that, and I don't begrudge the generation now that has access to more information and easier way to type papers and things along those lines. You have to just admit that the time is different. And I've seen it. My mother was an RN for 48 years. All of her 4 sisters are RNs. And you hear them talk about the younger generation. And it's not, no, they're not this, they're not that. They're just different. And we need to understand it. And that's where the challenge comes in knowledge transfer between generations that don't necessarily get each other. But the other thing you said that was really interesting about this, not fully selfless, but about profits and about selfless and about doing things. Maria Ross, I think, is a mutual connection of ours. She talks about these two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Empathy and compassion and being selfless towards your workforce does not have to come at the expense of profitability. It can be a both and versus an either or. So I think that's really important because many times, many of my guests who are talking to healthcare organizations about empathy, about compassion, about, employee experience and how that impacts patient experience and all of these things, they get frustrated quite often and say, why do I have to build a business case for compassion? Why do I have to build a business case to be more human? The good news is a lot of times those acts of humanity and those acts of being selfless and being human-centered show up on a balance sheet. So it's encouraged. Sometimes it's just about connecting the dots to a lot of these executives to show them that.
I think the short answer, too, is it comes down to fear. The fear is that if I show empathy, if I'm quote unquote soft, if I'm easy on people, then how am I going to get mine when it comes to the things I'm under pressure for from my board, if I'm the CEO, or my customers, if they're demanding in some way, or a project that's behind schedule? How is me being empathetic going to get us back on schedule or under budget? Well, the reality is that's a big leap of faith for people who were raised in a mindset, right, that was very much about scarcity, very much about people need to be, driven, not motivated, these kinds of things. And when we put our executives through business schools and we teach them everything about strategy and operations and technology, but we don't teach them the people parts, then naturally people-minded, either managers, HR professionals, et cetera, think, well, why do I have to make a business case about being human? Well, the answer is because you're uncovering or offsetting a lot of habitual ways of thinking about business. And I think that the fear that if we're human, interest oriented in the workplace, then we're not going to get the technical bits done. Some of it, I think we bring on ourselves by not making that business case. Because if we say, well, this should be obvious, well, it's not obvious. Again, leadership says it's not about you. It's not about the fact that you're understanding of the human connection. You have to understand about the other person, in this case, the executive, who's saying, like, I don't know how compassion gets us, better profits. Well, let's bring the studies. Let's talk about the nature of innovation and all these types of things that get better. Profitability gets better. Everything gets better. Absenteeism goes down. Productivity goes up, when people feel respect and trust and safety at work. So if we begrudge it and say, well, why should I have to do this? Well, that's that me-centered part. That's not a selfless form of leadership. But when it's saying that there's someone else who has a need, they need my knowledge, they need my understanding, they need me to help them connect some dots. That's a higher order way to approach that very situation.
Absolutely.
But I agree fundamentally with Maria's point. It is a yes and it can be. And the reality is all this stuff is interconnected. When we think about the way we treat employees shows up in how they treat patients, the way that all of that is going to show up on the bottom line. And while there might be externalities, especially in healthcare, that make things more challenging, probably than they should be, the reality is that they still get better if we're willing to do what I call the fast and free things. If you want to recognize somebody for doing a great job, that is fast and free. If you want to be kind and courteous, that's fast and free. You want to smile at somebody, doggone it, fast and free. If we won't do the fast and free things, then there's actually something else going on there, because we have no excuse to say, I don't have time or I can't afford that. No, do the fast and free things and watch everything else get slightly better. And once things get slightly better, we send those ripples through, then all of a sudden things are going to get a heck of a lot better. If we're willing to take that leap of faith.
When you talk about fast and free, you think something we talk about often on this show is compassion. Compassion is free. And what's very interesting about it, it's pretty much the only thing in the world that impacts three parties. It impacts the giver, the receiver, and the observer. So you talk about fast and free. A lot of fast and free can have that ripple effect to create a modernized culture that inspires people to abide by their purpose.
100%.
One other thing that's resonated with me about your work, because me and you both went through a very similar point in time of reflection. And I read, you wrote this and you talked about that you asked yourself 3 questions. And this might be a really good segue to your moment. I'm not sure. But you asked yourself, who am I really? Where do I fit in? And what difference am I making in the world? And I thought that was really powerful because I went through a very similar exercise. This story, people who have listened to this show know my story, so I won't go back into it. But I went through a very difficult time that really shaped who I am really. So when I got to the where I fit in and what difference could I make in this world, I was pretty well set on who I was. But the last 2, I could say to this day, I'm not even sure I had the answers to those last 2, and I'm looking for it every day. I don't know where I fit in. I've found some lanes to make an impact on the world, but I'm still trying to figure out where is the full-time home, the exact place where I can make the biggest impact, because that's why less than 2 years ago, I left a high-paying, cushy corporate job to answer that question. And it's been almost 2 years and I still haven't figured out exactly where I fit in. I have some ideas, but I'm still in search of it. So I'd love you to talk about that, about, asking yourself those 3 questions.
Yeah, and I honor the courage that you've demonstrated to walk away from that job and to be willing to say, I don't have it all figured out, and to keep seeking and keep searching. And that's something that we have to recognize, is that there is nothing permanent. Everything changes and evolves, and we have to be willing to do that. There was a time in my life when I would say that I had, I've had many moments, but the one that's probably most relevant for our conversation here was very much of a professional moment where I thought things were going really well in my career and I was perfectly happy and I was upwardly mobile and all these things that I told myself that I'd always wanted. And then all of a sudden, in March of 2020, when we were all sent home to be safe, and I was also, turning 50 and having that midlife excitement that some of us have. And then at the same time, my father was diagnosed with having kidney cancer. And while he's enjoying his retirement now, it was a reminder to me at the time that, we know how this movie ends. And all those three things, that cocktail kind of really hit me professionally speaking, because I was thinking more and more about sort of my place in the world, as you pointed out. And it just ripped the carpet right out from underneath me of saying, I want to make a difference. I want to understand and be confident in these things. And where I thought I had made it to some level of stability, I hadn't. And the moment for me was when I went to my bookshelf and I said, I am not myself. I felt like I was on the parallel path, like a service road next to the superhighway of life. And I was like, I'm not far off. I'm not but I'm not there. I'm not moving at the pace that I'm used to or that I wanted to. And so I was kind of like really seeking stability or a foundation or sort of reconciliation about how all this stuff is supposed to work. And I went to my bookshelf and I grabbed a book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And it made this point, and it said, in order to die well when the time comes, you must first learn to live well. And I thought, man, I am not living well at all. And so only through the practice of meditation and reflection and this type of thing did I hit on, what I call these really essential questions. I call them now the killer bees: being, belonging, something bigger than myself. I think to some extent we're all seeking these things. And when we don't have sufficient answers to those questions, then it kills our performance, our productivity, our intent to stay. And so those are the three questions that you had mentioned that I ended up kind of surmising here, which is when you think about being, who am I really? If you're not getting help at work, learning about your strengths, your values, especially when you're kind of a younger person, you haven't done a lot of that kind of soul searching yet, then if your manager's not helping you figure out who you are,
Right.
then you're going to go somewhere else to try to figure that out because you don't know. The second one about belonging, where do I fit in? Again, the same thing. If your company's culture, if your shift manager doesn't help you feel connected to the team socially, to your teammates, to the what your organization is all about, these types of things cause problems. And the last one is, something bigger than myself. Like, what impact am I making here in the world? And that's where I feel like, again, I'll go back to the manager, could be part of the company culture. Is it clear how your day-to-day activities are really these kinds of existential works? They're evidence that you're sending these ripples, that you're having an impact on something that's, going to carry well past you. And in healthcare, you would think that's the easiest part, because you're helping people heal. But at the same time, it can get a little transactional. And when that happens, when that's allowed to happen, then it erodes that sense of meaning and purpose. So then it becomes a sort of a gap when it comes to that third question. So for me, my moment was really born out of just sheer need. I was like, I am falling. I felt like I was falling. And I was clutching at anything I could and nothing was working. And I landed with a thud, thankfully, on a meditation cushion. But it invited for me this opportunity to connect various aspects of Eastern philosophy with Western psychology, all within a business context. And everything started to make a lot more sense to me. And I became willing to take what I was learning and try to make it a little bit more accessible for folks and start to let it shape my research. And I found that so many of us are going through this, where those questions are burning in our mind. And in the old days, you didn't look to work to answer those. You went to church,
Right.
you went to your community, your family was right next door. Those things are all gone now. They don't work that way anymore, especially for the youngest generation. But everybody goes to work, Jeffrey. So how's work helping us? Or is work actually hurting us? That's what we need to be able to answer for ourselves.
The way you just described that is very similar to someone in a group and a mentality that I've had the privilege to work with for over a decade. I worked with Marcus Buckingham, who's the original author of Strengths Finders. He since came out with a better model, but that being, what are your strengths? When Strengths Finders originally came out, you know what it was? It was kind of a mirror as to how you viewed yourself. And by the way, it's stayed pretty much the same, and it's remained that as kind of like a professional development tool, and a very positive one. But when Marcus and his team went to reinvent the strengths-based approach, they decided to ask different questions because people can never, you might take an assessment and you might answer it how you think your employer wants you to answer it. But if you ask questions about how something makes you feel, you know you're going to get accurate answers. And what Marcus Buckingham and his team at Standout created was an assessment of strengths that wasn't the mirror. It wasn't how you saw yourself. It's how you showed up to your teammates. How your strengths showed up to your team to create, as you said, that belonging. To create a team that was doing something bigger than themselves. Because I remember when I first took the Standout assessment, I looked at it, I go, this is ridiculous. This isn't me at all. And I brought it into my mentor, who's now a friend of mine, who was my boss at the time. And I said, look at this. Look at what they said one of my strengths were. And he goes, Jeff, that's what every person in this team comes to you for. When you talk about being and belonging, that ties so much into the research my colleagues have done, which they have more research on people, performance, team dynamic, and engagement at work than anyone. That how you show up to your team. So what is your being? What is your strengths? But more importantly, in the context of showing up at work versus just how you view yourself can be really eye-opening.
Yeah, I think that self-awareness is interesting that way, in that it's hard for us to have a completely objective and pure view of ourselves. We almost have to borrow the eyes of others. And not that the others see us perfectly either, because we're always shaping our impressions and letting in pieces, and depending on how much safety we feel, can we truly be authentic? How much are we authentic? Very few of us are exactly the same at home as we are at work. And, it's a different dynamic and it's complex. People are complex. We get it. But I think that somewhere between the triangulation of who I truly am, who I know myself to be, or at least think myself to be, and who others see me as, you're getting closer towards something that's more helpful, right? So I like the idea of bringing that together. And who I am really also, we have to recognize, is being challenged right now by things like AI, where all of a sudden we have very human-like creation capabilities through generative AI. It's leading some people to say, who am I really at work? Because a lot of jobs have functions that AI can do reasonably well, in which case, as they take on more and more of those things, well, what's left for us? What's my contribution? What things can I uniquely do? And I think this is challenging our sense, and it will continue to do so as these capabilities get stronger, of what it even means to be human. And I feel like this is why it goes back to something we said earlier. If you came up in the ranks 20 years ago, that entire lifestyle versus what we live today, where we are always on, bombarded by social, dealing with uber transparency when it comes to this. Dealing with Ubers is totally different. Yeah. Everything's totally different than it was 20 years ago. And so it's completely inappropriate to treat people as if, because they didn't go through what you're going through, they haven't earned something. They're going through what they're going through. The reality is it's just different. The levels of anxiety are off the charts for Gen Z. The levels of isolation and loneliness that remote workers feel today, totally different than what we had 20 years ago. This whole return to office, for people that don't necessarily have to, how does this work? All these things are playing out when you look across the workforce. So regardless of what industry you're in, healthcare or otherwise, taking a look at what's going on out there and then asking the question, how's it showing up in here? That's what I would love to see more of from leaders at every level.
I had Michael Goldberg, who was the CEO of one of the largest hospitals systems in New York City, and he was a CEO during COVID. And he talked about some chilling stories, but also very inspiring stories about it. But one of the things he said he put in place, and it talks to what you've mentioned, he had baby boomers in Gen X have millennial mentors. So the younger generation was mentoring the older generation so that, as I said earlier, the knowledge transfer and the understanding, because it doesn't matter what you went through 20 years ago, like you said. What matters is what we have access to today. And engaging the workforce where they are, making each generation, and that's what the best leaders do, is they make every generation feel seen, heard, valued. That's not easy. But in looking at the different perspectives of the different generations, I find that absolutely and when Michael told me that story, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so brilliant, because it's so outside the box for an industry that's so the way we've always done it. And that's why the true innovators are going to be the one that lead the way and light the way for the future of work.
Yeah, that type of reverse mentoring is powerful because it helps us to shift our perspective, but also to recognize that we can learn something from, other people who, in this case, if you look at the org chart is just the worst way of trying to explain how work gets done in any system, healthcare or otherwise. So now all of a sudden, when you start to think, well, how can I learn from my patients? How can I learn from the caregivers of my patients, right? Who have to, care for them when they're at home after they leave my office. How do I learn from my employees who are younger, who taking an active interest, making yourself a little bit humble and vulnerable and open to learning, like it's just such a better way. And if you could envision a workforce where everyone did that, like that the Gen Zers would have that much more empathy and understanding for boomers and vice versa. And people working across different departments, there's so many different systems that it takes to make a healthcare system run, on all of it. And the question is, if we had more empathy, more understanding, more curiosity, more safety, more trust, more all of these things, the business case would improve, right? The human benefits would improve, the care would improve, everything gets better.
And what you said, the org chart can be thrown out, because just like, I've been in HR for over 25 years, but during my wife's battle with cancer, I started to really see how the work actually happens in healthcare and beyond. It's not limited to healthcare, but in healthcare, it's a very unique, dynamic teams that work together to provide the care experience. I watched firsthand my wife hang on every word and instruction of the nurse that made her laugh. I saw her uplifted by a food service employee that sang to her, prior to, a procedure 2 days later. I saw social worker work with environmental services, work with the doctor, all to provide an amazing care experience. And one of the great things I was able to do at that health system in watching this through my eyes as somebody that has the future of work in mind, I was actually able to go to that HR department and say, hey, can you pull some numbers of patient experience and employee experience on this floor? I know that you typically don't do it that way, but I wanted to show them that I could see where the work was actually happening. And when the CHRO pulled those numbers, they said, Jeff, it's through the roof. Patient experience, employee engagement, everything. What did you see? And when we could start to look at the workforce, where the work is being done, and the dynamic teams where it's being done, all of a sudden we have actionable information. Because I talk a lot about, when I see that, I know where my best team leaders are. I know where the teams are that are 5 out of 5 say, my teammates have my back when I see it. And then if we're armed with that data, we can actually act on it. And we ask one question and one question only. How do we make more teams like our best teams?
Yeah, and I think the likelihood that those team leaders and those people acting in leadership roles on that team, the likelihood that they are self-interested, egocentric leaders is almost zero, because that's not the type of leadership anymore that allows complex systems to function. There's a time when we're in crisis mode. There's a time when there's a need because things aren't really well designed, that we have to muscle our way through some things. But even in the military, that type of approach is gone out the window compared to more sort of holistic leadership practices. And I think that it's a byproduct that's outlived its usefulness in organizational theory to try to pretend like the CEO is going to issue edict and then the next level down managers, and it's just going to be me all the way up and down the line. It's just not working anymore. People have choices where they're going to be employed. They have, there's too much complexity. We've evolved. So when you see those leaders who are producing those types of stellar business and people results, like what you're sharing, they are going to be these more enlightened leaders who are saying, yeah, of course I have self-interest, but I tried to put my needs last and make sure that other people's needs are being taken care of. Do they have the resources, the training? Am I smiling at them? Am I recognizing them? Am I trying to be courteous? Am I listening? Am I doing all these things that are about anything but me? It's about the mission. It's about the other people. That's the more updated form of leadership we need, the more enlightened form that we need. And when people feel they're a part of something and they're working on it together, they're addressing those 3 questions of mine that you shared earlier, only good things are going to happen. And again, it's almost always fast and free, at least a percentage of it. Let's start there. Before we do the hard stuff, let's do the easy stuff. Can we do that? What's it going to take? It's going to take that awakening, that sort of mindset shift for us to be able to get leaders at every level to recognize that this is the future. This is exactly how effective organizations, need to run.
And that's where I think it's got to be, there has to be dots connected for these people to create that, what I like to call aha moments, to say, oh my gosh, this is just being more human. The leader of that team floor that I referenced, when I went to the CHRO, I already had the answers to the test. I knew what was going to come back. Because I asked that team leader, I said, what's your secret? What's your, and she just said, Jeff, everyone here feels seen, heard, valued, and we teach everyone just to lead with compassion and everything else will take care of itself. And that comes back to the selfless model of leadership you talked about, because even when you're right, the systems can break you down, can create cynicism, can create negativity, can create burnout and things like that. But it's when we recognize it and we because I always say on this show, when we talk about the moment, sometimes we're not talking about the moment we connected to purpose. Sometimes we're talking about the moment we reconnected to purpose after going down a path that, and in your case, you recognized it and you just said, I'm not me. This is, I love the fact you talk about, you bring parts of the world, the East, the West, the beliefs, the things that were typically, as you said, meant for your personal life and things like that. And you translate them to the world of work. And I think that's really amazing, because it's going to take a different way of viewing things to transition to a more modernized leadership approach to the future of work.
Yeah, I think people really have felt that the lines between work and life have been blurred quite a bit. And while we're still trying to figure out what work-life integration really looks like, I feel like that's exactly one of my greatest joys, is being able to see those connections. And it's scary, and I don't begrudge executives for saying it's hard to get myself to go there, to think about this level of compassion, or the wellness, or trying to treat people and give them flexibility, for example. Even something as simple as that, like giving them autonomy, giving them flexibility. We know that workers are demanding this, but it's hard for us to give. Why? First of all, we never used to. So it's a new trick. The other is that it takes a leap of faith. It takes a lot of trust to be able to do that, a lot of transparency. But this is the thing, is that when we are recognizing that there is an awakening that needs to take place, because otherwise the old models aren't working anymore. They're just not working. We have to be willing to admit that. And if we think about how amazing it is to live today, the amazing things that are happening to our longevity because of advancements in healthcare science, the advancements that we have in management science, the advantages that we have in terms of access to technology and knowledge, and we can't figure out work, something we do almost all day, every day. Like, we can't figure that out? No, of course we can figure it out. It's the more human side of it that's holding us back. It's the fear, it's the egoism, it's the, I got to get mine. If we can move past those things, which we've been trying to do for the last 5,000 years, if you look in a philosophical or theological sense, it's not easy, right? But if we're willing to go there and bring that in, then I think we're going to have more human organizations. This is what it really comes down to, is that the bigger organizations get and the more technical they get, the more dehumanized they get. And they become very transactional and very technical, very sterile, if you will. The example of the leaders that you're talking about, bringing in compassion and making sure people are seen and respected and heard and valued, those are the human elements. So we have to rehumanize work if we're going to make this work. And that's why I think this egoless, sort of compassionate approach, this conscious approach that we're talking about, is so well poised and so necessary, yet so foreign to us. Because for centuries, we've kind of tried to make work look very mechanical. Well, it worked, but guess what? Now it's not working anymore. So now it's time to update that.
Yeah, it's just the recognition that things have to change and the openness to having leaders that are flexible enough to know the way we've always done it is not sustainable. Anything you'd like to add? Because I'd like to wrap up. And anything you're working on you want to share with the audience, or any last thoughts?
Always working on something, Jeffrey, I tell you. And maybe I'll come back on the show after I've had a chance to think about some more of the things that catch my attention. You mentioned the future of work. Love it. I'm doing a lot of work in the area of beliefs and collective beliefs these days. So I've got new research there. And also this kind of leadership progression, working our way through levels, moving up beyond some of the more technical bits and into those people systems and purpose systems. I'm always working on something and just learning everything I can from the people around me and just trying to translate it into tools we can all use to try to make our organizations and our work experiences better. So I appreciate the opportunity.
And Al, thank you for being here. As I said, the reason I start the show with the work that you do that resonates with me, that is synergistic, just the acknowledgement that the world of work is so vastly different, and the research you do, because I love science and evidence-based research that is executed by true human connection. And that's the research you do, and that's the research I've been privy to and loved working with. So thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate your time, and I will continue to follow you in your research. If there's any way I can be of assistance to any of your projects, you please let me know.
Will do. Thank you so much for having me on, Jeffrey. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on Moments of Experience. I hope today's conversation touched your heart and inspired you to reflect on the impactful moments in your own life. Remember, it's the seemingly small moments that often hold the most significant power to shape our lives and the lives of those around us. So keep your eyes open and do your best to be authentically present. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with someone who might benefit from our discussions. Until next time, I'm Jeffrey Smith, reminding you to cherish the moments that bring hope, connection, and purpose to your journey.